Okay, here we are. My friends, I'm very honored to share a very powerful mentor, guide, brother, friend of mine I've known for quite a few years. He lives in Los Angeles. He came visiting here, Canada, giving a seminar once a few years back. And when I saw his movement and his artistry and his capacity and his clarity, literally I was just like floored. And by that time, I was training martial arts for at least 30 years. And when I saw this man's capacity and understanding, but also his character and his integrity, it really blew me away. And it's been a passion and a joy of mine to be able to study with him when I get an opportunity. So I'd like to introduce to you a brother, friend, and legendary martial artist, Mark Mikita. Welcome today.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So, Mark, for those who don't know much about you, would you be kind enough to share just a little bit about your background and how you got involved in martial arts and where you're at now?
Wow, how do you do that? A little.
Take your time. Take your time. We've got time.
Well, simple historic background is that my father fought in the Philippines in World War II, and as was the case at that time, he lied about his age to join the army, so he was really just a kid, unbeknownst to them, and stepped off a landing craft in October of 1944 and fought for almost a year to the north in the Philippines. And it was extremely brutal, and he had a lot of close, personal, intimate contact with the Filipino guerrillas while he was there. And while nobody ever said the word back then, they were all escrimadores, obviously, which is practitioners of the art that I now teach. And when I became interested in martial arts at a young age, after I probably went through the phase where my parents figured out that, well, this is something more than just a phase, he started saying, we need to find you Filipino martial arts. He didn't know what they were called. Nobody said martial arts back then. So we started searching and hunting, and eventually he found a guy, and then I've been doing that ever since. So 50 plus years now of doing martial arts. So.
Wow. And you've had not only a deep practice in yourself for these last 50 years, you've also guided, mentored, taught many type of people around the world. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Well, I opened my martial arts school 2 weeks after I graduated high school. And it's been going ever since. So it's 40 plus years now. So it's sort of my, to think of myself, I have a martial arts school. It's funny because I never did it so I could have a martial arts school. I never cared about that. In fact, the only reason that my school is named after me, if anybody has a business out there, is because it's a lot easier to get a business license if you don't have to go through the fictitious business name thing. So it's just my name. It also pays to have a last name that looks Japanese. So, but that's just always been who I am. I opened a martial arts school so I could practice martial arts all the time. It was as simple as that. And I think one of my students, a very famous guy who was a student of Bruce Lee, Joe Hyams, he said I was the only teacher he'd ever studied with who could actually keep a martial arts school going. And this included Maso Yama and Bruce Lee and Bong Soo-han and Ed Parker and all these famous martial artists. And they all ended up going out of business here and there because it's not an easy business. You certainly don't open a martial arts school because you want to make money. So you do it because you have a passion. And I'm not 100% certain why the passion has never waned in me. It certainly has changed in character as I've gotten older and gotten more advanced in the art. But the passion is equivalent, if not much greater than it was when I first started. So,
Mark, what is, for those people who have never studied martial arts or curious about it, what is martial art, and how can it serve us as a whole being?
I'm going to start at the end of that. How can it serve us? One of my teachers, who was probably the most, I mean, it ends up being almost a cartoon in people's minds when I talk about him, but he was the one instructor I had who had actually been in intertribal skirmishes with other tribes in the jungle of the Philippines. So swords at 4 o'clock in the morning and 2 tribes trying to slaughter each other. So this happened many times in his youth prior to World War II. He was born in 1900. So from him, from a guy who was covered with scars, I used to call him a museum of scars. He said that the best thing would be for martial arts to become unnecessary, for it to pass into history and no longer be practiced, because the fundamental reason for its growth and expansion was the need to defend ourselves and to gain territory, and all the awful reasons that human beings wage war against one another. So sometimes they're good reasons, sometimes they're bad reasons. Usually there's a blending of those two depending on which side you're on. So as you've probably heard, war is not about deciding who's right, it's about deciding who's left. So so every culture, and there's been over the years, there's been different efforts by different groups to claim that their art is the original art, or the core art. The Chinese Kung Fu people come from saying, oh, it all originates in China. And there was a few years ago, there was this whole thing about it all originates in Africa. Well, if you want to say that all of us as human beings all originate in Africa, you can say that, okay. But that's how far back you'd have to go. Okay, it's all the way back. So disregarding that, every culture, whether you're in South America or in Antarctica, somebody needed to defend themselves. Somebody wanted their stuff, wanted their food, wanted their women, wanted their whatever, and you had to figure out ways to stop them from doing that. If you didn't, you would end up being their victim. So that is always the fundamental birth of defensive methods or martial arts. Martial, in the way that I teach, martial is simple, comes from the god of war, where my name comes from, Mark, same thing, which just means warlike, or for warfare. Art is the more difficult thing to explain to most people, because most people think of art in aesthetic terms, whether it's dance or painting or music. But as an artist, I'm also a painter. The art is not the end result. The art is the relationship the artist has with their subject, and the craft is the thing that gets what's in their head onto the canvas or into the air. So the craft of painting, the craft of playing music, lots of people can do the craft, but the art is to get the craft entirely out of the way. So there's a pure and direct relationship with the subject. So in martial arts, that's very obvious what that is, that if I'm fighting with you, we have a relationship based on distance, based on position, based on the weapons that we have, based on the environment. Is it light? Is it dark? Are we on a slope? Is it icy? Is it dry? All of those things are factored into the relationship. And whoever has a greater mastery of that changing, chaotic relationship is going to be victorious. So martial art, a martial artist seeks to essentially get the craft of his art out of his way. So whether it's kicking, punching, weaponry training, whatever it is, all of that is just craft. We want to transcend that and move that out of the way so that we can be in a pure and direct relationship with the opponent, and then organize the circumstances in our favor. It's as simple as that. So on a grander scheme, Bruce Lee used to say that life was combat and should be approached as such. You can approach everything in the same way that we approach martial arts, because to be a true martial artist, you have to be a master of life. You have to understand all of the aspects of the relationship. And those aren't only the immediate physical aspects. They're also, where does this opponent come from? Where does this enemy come from? What are his motivations? What is driving him? Perhaps I can steer him. Perhaps I can de-escalate this situation, because we don't always have to think in terms of what we would call melee warfare, 2 tribes clashing in the middle of the night. We can also think of that guy on the street who's trying to get your wallet, or the guy in the party who has decided, because you threaten him on some level that you have no party to, he decides he has to make you into a victim. There are a lot of ways to handle that don't necessarily include maiming him or killing him. And we would certainly want to be able to do the least amount of damage to our fellow man. So one of the things, and I know that you've studied a lot, one of the things we learn as martial artists is that while the body is an incredibly powerful mechanism, it's also an incredibly vulnerable and weak mechanism. It is relatively easy to utterly destroy in a few seconds. And learning how to do that, that craft again of learning to do that and doing it seriously, not just going through pretend sets of movements and wearing stylish clothing and all that, but actually talking about how to disrupt and dismantle another human being's anatomy in an intelligent, efficient way. When you start doing that, you become, how can I put this? You essentially run face first, head on into the perennial questions that warriors have been asking themselves for thousands upon thousands of years, which is, when I learn how to do this, when I acquire the skill and develop it to a high level, how does it change my humanity? How does it affect me? How does it affect my tribe? How does it affect my life going forward? How does it affect the people that it touches? What is my responsibility in that regard? Those questions are the reason why there is such a strong and oftentimes misguided philosophical underpinning of martial arts. It'll either go into Taoism or Confucianism or Shintoism or whatever culture. It'll go toward Christianity or whatever. It'll always go towards something to try to answer those questions. Those questions can't be answered by anything that is outside of yourself. That is an inward search. So those things are desperate attempts to avoid the inward search, which is much more arduous and difficult. So I always look sideways at people who can very eloquently quote Confucianism or Taoism, but they themselves are not leading an exemplary life as a martial artist. So it's all bells and whistles, but they themselves actually being what they're saying they're being, or suggesting that you should be. One of the things you may have read my materials on the website that I have, but one of my feelings is that anybody who walks through the door of my school isn't coming in there because they want to stay the same.
Yes.
Okay, so they're coming in because they want. The way I've come to describe it is that they aspire to be a greater version or a better version of themselves. So my job, the job of a teacher, the job of the school, the job of all of the students in the school are all to be mechanisms to assist and aid that person in becoming the person that they aspire to be. So the end result, if you're 90 years old and you never got to hit somebody with a spinning back kick, you did well. Okay, so somewhere along the line, you figured out how not to enter into conflict with other human beings. I'm a great follower of Krishnamurti's philosophy, and Krishnamurti used to say that there's only one ultimate conflict, which is an inward conflict that leads to all kinds of outward conflict, and that's the conflict between what is and what should be, and that constant battle between what we believe we are supposed to be or should be and what we actually are, and that creates all the insecurities in the world, all the conflicts in the world that can all the way lead to nuclear warfare. So he also said that regardless of where we are on the earth, regardless of whether we're in an icy terrain or on the desert, whoever we are, rich or poor, we are ultimately all in need of nurturing and shelter and food and water, and we are therefore, each one of us, actually the rest of mankind. So it's sort of the way that I approach teaching, is that your physicality, whether you're better or worse than the next guy, something I say to people all the time when they get involved in this testosterone-driven, I have to be better than kind of thing. As much as I'm a fan of, you can see on the wall behind me, there's a Conan the Barbarian poster. It's my wife, strangely enough, is a huge Conan the Barbarian fan. But I've bumped into Arnold Schwarzenegger at the gym over the years many times, and he's a hilarious guy, and he is an amazing bodybuilder. And as physical as he was, and as much money as he made as an actor from his physicality, 100 years from now, nobody will remember his name, but they'll still be talking about Stephen Hawking, who couldn't move. So better than and greater than is all relative, and it's all about perspective. So just because you're physically able to defeat another person doesn't mean you're superior to that person. And it's a big dilemma, especially in the modern era of focus being on mixed martial arts, where it's all about trash talking and beating up on people. And I always whenever I talk about mixed martial arts, the people who are really into mixed martial arts, I'll say, okay, 3 years ago, who was the heavyweight UFC champion? And nobody can ever tell me who that was, because it so matters not. It's just so immaterial. And I'm all for people having sporting enterprises, but I also have an issue with using a craft that is designed to destroy a fellow human being as a way to gain fame and fortune. I have an issue with that. That to me is an ethical conundrum. I'm going to intentionally go out and try to destroy that person, so much so that I want to hit them hard enough to cause a concussion, which is what we call a knockout. And that's always damaging, no matter what. So I'm intentionally trying to hurt another human being who hasn't harmed me, who hasn't threatened my family, who just because, and now I've gained some tiny measure of fame and fortune. It's pretty horrible, to be honest. So,
thank you. You know, this brings us to the intensity of the violence of martial art and the perspective and the intention that you're coming with. You know, the way I learned it was there was two sides, the yin and yang side. The yang side being the self-preservation element, the capacity to defend yourself, take care of your family, your society, and all those high virtues. But then it needed to be balanced with the yin aspect, which is self-perfection, learning to take on a path where you are mastering the violent urges. You're not just going out and lashing. You're becoming humble, as one of my mentors used to say. He says, it's better to be humble all the time than to be humiliated all at once from having this, you know, pumping up your own ego with this externalization of strength. Can you share about why it's valuable for us, especially in the circles I'm in Warrior Sage circles? Many of us are very interested in human potential, developing ourselves, but the idea of embracing or entering the dimension of violence is considered bad. How can I'd love you to share about violence and how we can grow us, and what is the approach that we should take?
Well, it's a big apple bite. That's a big check to bite.
I give you a few apple. I give you a tree there to chew on.
Well, as you know, it's not my nature to answer questions in a cursory fashion. So I don't naturally lean toward giving you an off-the-cuff answer. It's not my way. So I figure if you've gone to the trouble to formulate the question, you probably want a real answer. So
absolutely.
I'll go back to Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti was a very good friend of Gandhi, by the way, and used to tell people that in India, Gandhi is forgotten, and now they want nuclear weapons. So there's a tendency, and you and I have had conversations about the whole namaste thing and all the way people latch onto these things as being somehow important. Krishnamurti said, man is violent, and the ideal of nonviolence is only an immature approach to violence. What is important is to face the violence and understand it and move beyond it, and not invent an escape called nonviolence, which has no reality whatsoever. So it's very easy for people to latch onto that and say, I am nonviolent. But if you have read anything about Gandhi, you understand how implausibly courageous that statement is. Because to be nonviolent doesn't mean to be cowardly and to be afraid to be violent. It means to have no violence at all. That if I come up and smash you in the face, not only will you not do anything, but you will have no violent reaction whatsoever, internally or externally. That's a giant undertaking to find that kind of centeredness to where the violence around you does not create violence within you. So what I like about what Krishnamurti said is, rather than pretending, which is what almost everyone is doing when they say, I am nonviolent, rather than pretending that, because all you need to do is watch them drive and you'll find out whether they're violent or not. Okay? Put them in traffic. Any situation.
Talking with their spouses, being with their children.
Anything where there's any kind of conflict where they're no longer in control, or their lack of control, or their natural subjugated state. And by that, I mean that I can get really psycho about this. But let's just take one thing. why is it you think that when you look at your bill for the electric company, that there's a PO box and not an actual address where you can go? Okay. Because every time
and the tax office too, right? And the tax office too.
Because that's a martial art in and of itself. They're protecting themselves from the people who they're essentially robbing. And I'm not saying it's wrong for them to charge, but after a while you realize that every other Thursday, click, 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 bills keep going up and they just keep profiting. And you know that you have no recourse. And every time you get a tiny ticket, I remember when I was in my late teens when I first started driving, in the town I was in, if you got a parking ticket and you paid it within 24 hours, it was $5. I haven't gotten a parking ticket since then. It's one of my personal rules not to get tickets of any sort. So, because it just means you're not being aware. So, but I'm pretty sure that they're way more expensive than that. And all of us know that it's not about you somehow harmed somebody. There's no victim in this crime. This is just about revenue. So after a while, you start to feel like the government all around you is continuously sticking their hands in your pockets and you are being subjugated at all times. So when you get into your car and you're barely able to make your ends meet and you're having fights with your wife because you can't make ends meet and your children are driving you crazy and you're late for work and blah, 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 blah. And that guy in front of you signals and does everything right, but in your mind, he cut you off. And now you have to threaten his life and all the people's lives around you so that you can get in front of him, even though there's 45 million people ahead of that guy that you're not going to be in front of. That doesn't matter. Now this little microcosmic battle has to ensue. And that's exactly what I'm talking about, that idea of violence being present in us. And this is something I so appreciated Krishnamurti being so concise in saying, that rather than having these ideals that we can paint beautifully on our walls and say, that's who I am. He said, don't do that at all. He just said, say it. Say, I am violent. Because you are. You are. You naturally compete with people. It's a natural thing. It's why we have succeeded as species. Okay, so all of those things can be directed toward things in a positive way. It's when we deny them in ourselves. The saying is to deny our truth is to give it strength beyond endurance. Okay, so when we deny that violence in ourselves, we're more likely to see it take over and guide us rather than us guiding it. So the fundamentally on that yin side, as you were saying, on that self-perfection side, if I say to a student, I'm going to put this in practical terms, if I say to a student that I want their hand to be like this and not like that, that seems inconsequential, except that the idea of mastering that is about mastering you. You saying, I want my hand to do this, and having your hand listen to you and do that. That sounds easy, but try painting a picture or playing a piano. That's all they're doing. Their hand is just doing what they tell it to do. Okay, so the mastery of that is what the art is all about on a high level. It wouldn't have kept me interested for more than 50 years if it was about hurting other people. Okay, that's certainly the fundamental grounding that it has, and that's why it's confronting to us, especially as men, because we're expected as the males of the species to protect our families, to protect the tribe, etc. So there is a yoke that's put on our shoulders at a young age, and as you know, there's very little in the way of rites of passage for males anymore. So most of the 45, 50-year-old men who are walking around feel like little kids. Okay, so for them to say, yes, I'm going to step forward and defend my family and my tribe with no training at all, it's a fantasy at best, and it could get a husband or a father killed or imprisoned for life. That fantasy that they're living in. So to go back, it really is. I mean, you said yin and yang. Bruce Lee used to say, what is yin and yang? And he would say, not two. Okay. They're one. So the oneness of that is that you don't get the benefit of that self-perfection unless you look directly and unerringly at the truth of the violence of it. Okay, when you modify that so it's comfortable, you defeat it at both ends. So when I pretend to do combat, when I say, for example, that ultimate fighting is truly ultimate fighting, I'm deluding myself. Just throw a knife into the ring and watch what happens. Okay, watch the desperate fight to acquire the knife and then watch the fight after. Okay, so that'll change everything. All of a sudden, all of the sportsmanship and everything else, which is all a factor of sport. In real fighting, there is no sportsmanship. Okay, so that is right away confronting, because we have this phrase in our heads, fighting fair. Anybody who does real martial arts knows that that's a ridiculous statement. So why on earth would I do that? Why would I send my military to defeat another enemy? And when I realize that I have more tanks than them, send some of my tanks back so we have an equal situation. It makes no sense whatsoever, okay? So it's only truly actually only in westernized approaches to martial arts, and post-World War II particularly, where we have this neutered version of martial arts, where we think of martial arts as an unarmed activity. In any other culture, what fool would step onto a battlefield without a weapon in his hand? So weaponry is the first and foremost core of all martial arts. And any unarmed martial art expression is simply an adjunct to an armed art. For example, jiu-jitsu is a support art to kenjutsu. Okay, the samurai wouldn't say, hey, let's grapple. Okay, they would cut you down in your place, or they would run you through with their spear or with arrows. And if all of that was lost, or they closed with the enemy and couldn't access the weapon, for a very brief moment they would grapple. But the last thing they wanted to do was lay down on the ground so that 27 other guys could come over and spear you when you're on the ground. So this modern distortion of let's roll around in pajamas on a nice soft mat. Take the same art out, go in the parking lot where there's windshield glass and car parts. Okay, and see how comfortable you are pulling guard, okay, slamming yourself into the floor. Okay, so I'm not discounting the value of grappling. You know, I don't feel that way, but I do take issue with the distortion of the way that we look at it.
And considering it as whole and complete in itself, yes, where it's only an augment to it, yes, to warfare.
It would make no sense to be whole and complete in itself without weapons. Just a penknife will change the entire situation. Okay, just a large nail that you have in your pocket will change the entire situation. But it doesn't need to be a dedicated weapon. It can be anything that you improvise on the spot. Nothing like a brick. Okay, so
those of you who will have the fortune to meet Mark in his school in Venice Beach area in Los Angeles, your wall is filled with incredible weaponry of all different eras, different cultures and such. Can you share about that? And there's one thing you also said to me years back about asymmetrical warfare, that, you know, if there's someone much larger than you, I'm not going to be able to use the same empty hand techniques.
Of course,
in some way. So,
well, also asymmetry doesn't have to just be a disparity in sizes. It can also be the extreme likelihood that person will be armed. Okay? If we just simply think in terms of only rape and only murder, two horrible things to think about. What's the likelihood that somebody who's setting out to rape you or murder you is armed? Okay, so right away, two things that we're very fearful of having happen to us or our loved ones, it's very reasonable to presume that that person will be armed. So how on earth are you seriously approaching self-preservation if you're practicing a martial art that never talks or deals with weapons? It makes no sense whatsoever. So if we wouldn't approach anything else in our life this way. We wouldn't go to a surgeon who has only done surgery by reading books. He's never actually physically done it. We don't want him to touch us, but it's much more comfortable if we practice stylized versions of martial arts and then make this giant leap to presume that if I simply practice this set form enough times, it'll automatically happen when I do it in reality. That's 100% false and just won't work at all. There's something, I was just talking about this in my class that we do. Two classes in this same mode right now on Zoom. And this subject came up and I said, look into the incidents, and I certainly encourage anybody who's listening or watching to do this. Look into what's called the incidence of non-firing in battle. For example, on the battlefield of Gettysburg, many muzzle-loaded muskets were found repeatedly loaded, one bullet on top of another, next to a dead soldier. It's very simple to figure out why this happened, because if I'm loading, I don't have to kill anybody.
Interesting.
And it's not in our nature, as much as people would like to make this leap that it is not in our nature to kill our fellow man. We wouldn't be here if it was. In fact, our natural modes of combat with no training whatsoever are borderline ridiculous if you look at them. Two men will stand within the range of their best weapons. They'll stand right up and they'll expose their most vulnerable target by putting their hands behind their back and lifting their chin up so their trachea, their groin, everything is totally exposed and they're in range of their opponent's strikes. And this is the beginning of an altercation. This is all about posturing and everything else. It's all about whose you-know-what is larger than the others. It's all about who can make the other person feel like a victim or dominated. So it's this whole interview process. It's not warfare. Again, the analogy I'll oftentimes use is if we go back several thousand years and we're part of the same tribe and we're hunting a mastodon or a mammoth. And we've got, let's say there's 6 or 7 of us and we all have spears. We haven't figured out how to make an atlatl yet, which is a spear thrower. So we all have to use our spears as a group to bring this huge animal down. And if I decided the night before we're going to do this hunt that I disagreed with you in some way, shape, or form, and I attacked you and crippled you and made you incapable, now all of us are going to starve to death. So after thousands of years, by a simple natural selection, the guys who did that didn't survive. And the guys who didn't do that and figure out other ways to solve their conflicts did survive. So as a species, we are actually not well suited to combat. We don't have any fangs that are of any value. We have no claws. I always say a Shih Tzu can outrun you, a guppy can outswim you. Okay, so we're not like the most fantastic physical specimens. As much as we have all these sports, there's basically no sport that other animals can't beat you at. I used to have greyhounds. My greyhound would sleep 23 hours a day. And then he'd get up and run at world record speed with no effort, then go back to sleep for 23 hours a day. So he could jump an 8-foot fence with no run, just hop over it like it was nothing. So he's extraordinary physical specimen. A huge price to be paid for having that ability. It's why they sleep so much. Okay, so to be able to hold their spine in like a bridge between their pelvis and their shoulders takes a huge amount of energy, more than 80% of their caloric intake. So whereas if you have good posture, 20% of your caloric intake is being used for that. So it allows us to have a big brain and to utilize it. So if we're on all fours, totally different. So you can see this is my nature. I start pulling from all kinds of things, science and paleontology and all kinds of things, because it all comes back to this. We know from the fossil record that Neanderthal picked up something probably in the range of 70,000 to 120,000 years ago and brained another Neanderthal, crushed his head. We can tell from the kinds of damage we find in the skulls. So this weapon, and this happens to be rattan, but let's just think of it as a stick. This weapon is unquestionably the oldest weapon in the world. Stick fighting. Forget about where it comes from, because when it originated, those places that it now is presumed to come from didn't exist. Okay, the tectonic plates were in an entirely different place. Yes. So those nations, those languages, it predates all of that. So this is so old that it is part, and I've talked to you about this before, it's part of your genetic makeup. I can bring an old woman in off the street, hand her a weapon, and when I go to strike her, she'll automatically block it. Where did she learn how to do that? And you can see that rattan has nodes in these sections of growth. If I said to her that I wanted her to hit this last node, almost invariably, she will be able to do so accurately the first time and every time thereafter. So where did she learn how to do that? Okay, this is what's in Latin called a priori knowledge that is inherent in our genetic encoding, if you want. I doubt that she could do a jump spinning back kick or a triangle jump. Those are skills that she's going to have to acquire through a lot of work and a lot of time on the mat. But the fundamental skills of weaponry training are so innately a part of us that I spend most of my time doing what Bruce Lee actually described as teaching, what the ultimate essence of teaching was, which was to show the student the cause of his own ignorance. Okay, to get him out of the way of himself, to show him that he actually already knows. And he's simply standing in his own way. So I can show people this in a very direct and practical way, and it kind of blows their mind that they actually already know. So once you can get past that, and I oftentimes use some interesting, they sort of come about in the process of teaching. Is I take a different approach to teaching, as you know. I try to teach through the student's eyes as opposed to just giving them the set form. In the process of doing that, I found over the years that teaching people through children's games is really helpful. So I'll show them things that they've been doing since they were a little kid, like keep away, for example. If you play keep away well, you're doing what we call an escrima quintata. You're organizing the circumstances in your favor, which is all keep away is. Okay, you're just preventing the person from doing whatever it is they're trying to do. And when I get someone to think in those terms, all of a sudden they can do this skill that they've been trying for months to be able to do and couldn't accomplish. And I just say, well, just play keep away. And all of a sudden, they automatically do it. So it's in them. They just have to have access to it. And my job is to get them out of the way of that access, because that knowledge is already there. So that's actually what makes teaching fun, because I get to see those epiphanous moments when you see people's eyes open up and they go, oh my God. You're right.
Like every 20 seconds in your class.
Well, I think one of my favorite things that happens when I teach is when a student who's been studying with me for a while, sometimes several months or a year or two, they'll look at me just completely awestruck and they'll go, you're right. No, I've been lying the whole time. Yes, that's why you came to me, because I have a skill in this. So that's what makes teaching fun, though. If it was just me saying, follow this pattern and do it right, and giving you rank and doing all that stuff, I don't know how. To me, that's like studying medicine and becoming a proctologist. You kind of miss the point. Okay, so there's so much more to medicine. You can heal people and save people's lives. I'm always puzzled by somebody who thinks that their goal in life is to be a proctologist. So, no offense to proctologists out there. They're certainly necessary.
Okay, I want to ask you, here we are in this very unprecedented time. We've heard it in many different ways. I'd like to know what your viewpoint of this, from your experience as a consummate martial artist. What do you feel is going on, and where are we heading?
Oh boy. First of all, it's the first time we've looked at disease this way, which is problematic. It's the first time we've thought that the right thing to do is to quarantine the healthy. That's not how you attack disease. You quarantine the sick and you quarantine the people who are at risk. And the rest of the people continue on about their lives, providing all of the things that those people who are in quarantine need. But when we lock everybody else in their houses and kill businesses and kill economies and kill everything, it's definitely a case of the cure being worse than the disease. So it's sad. And there's also tons of misinformation out there. I think there's a lot of manipulation of numbers. I think one of the people from the CDC, just the other day, CDC here in the States, said, "Oh, we've been overestimating by 25% all of our numbers." Well, that's kind of important, okay. And also, when you think about the fact that in no country where we're fighting this illness, whether it's here in Europe or in Asia, has the survival factor is over 99%. You just get sick and you get over it. It's not like it's a scourge. It's not like the Black Death. You really can't compare it to the bubonic plague or the Black Death. It's just not even close. So, but when you tell everybody that you can't touch anything and everybody has to wear a mask and they all have to be terrified and they all become more and more and more and more terrified. And now you've got all these people acting like sheep in their houses and afraid to do anything, afraid to talk to anybody, and they start shaming each other. And I don't know if you remember, you probably do because you're an old guy like me. You remember Donald Sutherland in Escape of the Body Snatchers, where he pointed at it like that. That's right. That's what people are doing. And it's ridiculous. If I'm 90 feet away from you, I don't need to be wearing a mask. Okay, so yeah, it's a sad state of affairs. I mean, it's terrible that people are getting sick. I certainly don't want people to be sick of anything, but it's not a correct analogy But if the world was running its normal way right now, more people would be dying in car accidents. But we don't stop the whole world for that. And we certainly don't stop the whole world for all the people who are going to die this year of the flu or of anything else. This doesn't make a lot of sense. I understand some of the reasoning, and I'm okay with taking some of the precautions and but I've been taking those precautions before we did this. For example, in my school, there's hand sanitizer everywhere. People are using it all the time. It's been a rule in my school for 30, 40 years that if you're sick, don't come to class. Don't come to class until you are not just feeling better, but you've been not sick for at least a week or two. Okay, you just don't. I've actually turned people away at the door. Oh, I feel a little scratchy. Get out, go home. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Obviously, I don't want the students to get sick, but on a more practical, personal, selfish level, I have to come to class. So if I get sick, I have to come to class anyway. Okay, so now everybody's going to get sick. So I have to be very vigilant about that. So that's been a norm. So that's just basically what we're going to do is exactly the same thing we've been doing. So I feel bad for people doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. That's pretty hard to maintain any kind of social distancing. Okay, we can always armor up and use long staffs until this is gone. So that's not a problem. We can do that. We got face masks and the whole bit. But in arts that are much more touchy-feely, it's going to be very difficult. So, yeah, I don't, and there's so many other businesses too. I do find it problematic if you've been to any of the, like Target or Costco or anything like that. People's understanding of social distancing is basically nil. So all the efforts of everybody who's trying to stay at home are all basically erased entirely by anybody who has to go out and buy food anymore. Because now you're in this melee of everybody shoulder to shoulder shoving. And it was only just recently, by the way, I don't know if you've had this experience, but it was only just recently, in the almost 8 weeks now that we've been dealing with this, that we were actually, my wife and I were actually able to find toilet paper. Only just recently.
Oh,
like a week ago.
oh man.
So thankfully we had enough of a supply prior to that, but holy crap, that was a good phrase. Not a good situation, but again, what on earth is that about? You know? So it's a little sad to watch people freak out like that. I certainly haven't done that. So
this is my point I wanted to ask you regarding fear, freaking out, intensity overriding ourselves. You bring people to the edge of duress and help us expand, stay there, be present, not collapse under fear. Can you share about how everyone, some pointers on how folks can manage, work with fear?
Sure. Well, you may have heard the kind of long time saying, it's often in the military when I've worked with Marines and so forth, that danger is real, but fear is a choice. Okay. There's absolutely real dangers out there. How we react to those and whether or not we allow fear to come in and overwhelm us is a choice that we make, and training can help us to make that choice in a more intelligent way. Fear can be, we don't want to be devoid of fear. Being fearless is being foolish. Okay, fear is a very good driving force. It's what makes us look both ways when we cross the street. Okay, it's what makes us check anything. It's what makes us check the locks before we close the door. We understand that danger is out there. We put on a seatbelt not because we intend to get into a car accident, but because we know the danger of a car accident is very high. So we take those precautions. That's a very tiny droplet of fear that we use as a guide for us in the daily life. It's not an overwhelming fear or a suffocating fear. And that's the kind of fear that we want to basically get rid of in our life. The problem is that most people attack that or approach that by trying to eliminate fear, eliminate situations where there's fear. They cordon off their neighborhoods, they cordon off their children, they cordon off everything so that they never confront anything. On an interesting side note, I ask my students sometimes, because I come from a different era, I ask them, how many tree houses did you guys build when you were a kid? Most of the time it's 0. I must have built 30, okay? And some of those tree houses were like 30 or 40 feet up in the tree. And we were climbing with 2x4s and hammers in our neck and going up and hammer, and no sense of how to build a structure that was sound other than, hey, that feels a little creaky. Let's put a few more nails in it. And yeah, you could have gotten hurt. We didn't, but we figured out really quickly. In fact, you and I grew up in the era when a playground was made out of concrete.
Yeah. And
there were monkey bars, there were slides, and there was the spin around and vomit ride, the merry-go-round that would kill you if you got on it the wrong time. And yet, I don't remember anybody being hurt on the playground when I was a kid, because the danger was right there in front of your face. Unless you were an idiot, you weren't going to get hurt. So I don't know if you know this, but when the prevalence of bicycle helmets started becoming the norm, head injuries went up. Really? Yeah, because people became less vigilant about not falling because they had a helmet on. Okay, so you can, the research is out there. The same thing happens with motorcycles. And also, if you don't know this, like boxing headgear, people will oftentimes say, well, it's not safe, they should all wear headgear. Headgear actually increases head trauma for boxers. There's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, it creates more padding, so the person who's hitting can now hit harder because their bones won't be damaged by the hard impact. It also makes that person's head a little bit larger, so now the torque is greater. They essentially increase the length of the wrench on their brain. So it increases acceleration forces. So it can actually make brain trauma much worse wearing headgear. So there's all kinds of fallacies out there. But again, it's all about, if we just keep nerfing our life, if we keep putting more and more foam around us, we'll somehow be safe. I think it's Helen Keller who said, outright facing danger is you're just as safe as if you were hiding, because it just doesn't work on a certain level. It certainly doesn't work in warfare. Being an isolationist country didn't help us. Okay, it didn't help us. And after World War II, the United States, basically the primary thing that we set about making a reality and have always kept as a primary driving force since then is never again. Never again will we be caught flat-footed. Never again will anybody get us with a surprise attack. Never again will we be at a disadvantage. Never again. And that's a good thing, and it's ended up making us be the defender of many other countries, which is fine with me. But it's the way people should approach their own lives and their families and so forth. It's a little bit childish to presume that when a violent thing is happening to you, that the policeman is going to suddenly be there when you call him. You can look up the average time. I mean, you live out in the country. How long does it take a cop to get to your house?
At least 20 minutes, 30 minutes.
Yeah. So if I'm stabbing you, how's that going to help you? Okay, so no offense to law enforcement, but they're most of the time just report takers. They're not there to help you. They can't be. It's not reasonable to presume when a violent occasion happens that person will be there. It's just not reasonable. So taking a realistic approach and saying, I'm going to arm myself, which is my first suggestion. I'm going to arm myself not only perhaps with a weapon or some semblance of a weapon, but also going to arm myself with intelligence and vigilance. Those are things I can teach you. I can teach you vigilance. I can give you all the preparation stuff. The question I always have to ask the students is, will you actually do it? So that willingness to actually do it is a question that the student has to ask. But in a greater scheme, in situations like this, where the enemy is not so much a person or a specific situation, but it's a disease, the reality is we've been dealing with this since we were children. There have been these illnesses. You probably know what MRSA is. Okay, but this is horrifying, and it's ubiquitous. It is everywhere. It is on your skin right now. Okay, it is everywhere, and if your immunity is weak, it becomes flesh-eating bacteria. So, but it's on you all the time. The two best places to get MRSA, do you know where they are?
The hospital.
Bingo. And the gym.
Oh.
Two best places. Okay, so you can be certain that those places are filled with MRSA, which is basically an antibiotic-resistant staph infection. One of my students is a neurosurgeon. He says that 90% of the work he does prior to a surgery, where he's washing his hands and draping himself, 90% of that is because of MRSA. 90%.
Wow.
Yeah. So we're not closing the schools or shutting down businesses because MRSA, it's everywhere. It literally is ubiquitous. If you went to the school and wiped the desks and took a culture, MRSA is on the desks at the school where your children are going. It's just everywhere. So you can't get rid of it. So, but we don't shut everything down. So the first thing we need to do is kind of get some perspective. Take a couple of steps back. When there's a list every night on the news of the deaths, the problem with that is they're not listing all the deaths from everything else. So you have no perspective. Okay, you don't know how many people fell down and killed themselves today. Just simply an accident. Okay, so we can nerf that too. We can, make everything baby-proof, but ultimately we can't prevent certain levels of injuries. We can't prevent diseases. My mom used to say that in average childhood, a kid should eat at least 2 cups of dirt. Because that's what makes for a strong immune system.
Yes.
Okay? If you try to hide your child, you make them much more susceptible to illnesses by doing that. So I'm not saying run over to the guy's house next door who has COVID-19 and rub yourself all over him. You take natural precautions, but I'm saying that the ridiculousness of locking ourselves in our houses and shutting down our economies and destroying our countries doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. So,
thank you. I want to complete today with an inspiration, something that when you shared with me, it really blew my mind. And you shared with me years ago that as a youngster, you realized that junk food or sugar or candy wasn't good. And so you just dropped it. You didn't do it. Can you share about that in yourself, how you deal with personal disciplines to cultivate yourself, strengthen yourself, and then some inspiration for us who might not have that resolve of discipline?
Well, first of all, we have to, when you talk about discipline, people have different ideas of what discipline is. And I think when you're talking about self-discipline, I think one of the first things that people think of in one way or another is building walls around themselves, cutting off certain things. And that's the worst way you can think about discipline. Discipline is about living a more fulfilled life. Okay? That's what discipline is about. It's about doing the things that make you the happiest and not letting things that would impede that or diminish that come into your life. So if we create something simple, a more simple analogy, if we think of a young person, male or female, who decides that they want to compete in the Olympics, well, they certainly choose whatever the event might be. Let's say they want to throw the javelin. Well, that's great. They're going to be throwing the javelin a lot in preparation. But they'll also start doing a lot of other things. They'll start making certain that they're training their musculature so they get the greatest amount of musculature in the time frame that they have, because they are limited. They certainly can't do any performance enhancing drugs because that's not discipline, that's just cheating. Okay, so if that person is being ethical in their approach to this, then they have a certain amount of time, they have a certain amount of work that they can do. They also have to take their rest into consideration. So they're going to be wanting to sleep, get the most amount of quality sleep that they can get, so they get the greatest amount of recovery from their training. They're going to want to start feeding the machine better so they get the greatest performance. So all of that is discipline. I don't think any one of those athletes thinks of it as wall building. Okay, they think of it as steps toward a goal. So I've often, there's a thing that I've always had in my head that I've always loved because it's such an easy way to keep things in mind. And it's an old saying that with one eye on the mountaintop, keep the other eye firmly affixed to the trail. Okay, because it's very easy to wander off into the forest and to miss the trail, or to realize that as you're walking along, the mountaintop you thought was close is actually 2 mountaintops away, and you have a much further path to take. And each person's path on that mountain is different. So following my path can be helpful, and that's what the teachers are for, is they can give you hints along the way, but followers are not people who are disciplined. Followers are just followers. Okay, so discipline is a self thing. So to answer the first question, which is, this all started when I was so young. There was a period of time, I started very young in martial arts when I was just a kid. And I started hearing everybody always talking about discipline and self-discipline. And as you know, I'm a little older than you are, but when we were kids, there weren't any such things as storefront martial arts schools. Yeah. Most martial arts schools were somebody's basement sometimes a church hallway or a recreation center. Most of the time, military guys who had had some training. That was the first taste that most people had of being able to train. And then in the early 70s, when the Kung Fu craze happened, it kind of exploded. So early on, I started hearing all this stuff about self-discipline. Oh, this master could do that, and this master could do that. And so since nobody I was studying with or was interacting with was doing anything of the sort, I started personally exploring this idea of self-discipline. You know, a couple of interesting things along that line. My father talked about they had liberated a prison camp in the Philippines and liberated a bunch of American POWs. And these poor 6 foot tall soldiers who weigh like 100 pounds, 89 pounds, things like that. He said they were all just sleeping on slabbed concrete in 120 degree temperature. And my dad said, so anytime you think, because we moved around a lot as a kid, I was a military brat. So he said, anytime you think you have it rough, just remember that guy sleeping on his skeleton on the concrete floor. So no soft muscles to sleep on and no mattress to sleep on. So, here I am as a kid. I thought, well, I need to explore this idea of self-discipline. So for many months, I just put a sheet on the concrete floor in the basement and slept on that, just to see if I could discipline myself to overcome the excruciating pain that it brings upon you. And I was able to do that. I was very fanatical, is probably a mild word for it.
Yeah.
Very fanatical. And it was really, truly about wanting to be able to say, I am disciplined, not because I'm following somebody, not because somebody else says I should, but because I am in control. So diet was a very easy way to say, who's in control of this, me or somebody else? Somebody else's opinions or my choices. So I started, wasn't a lot of information back then on what was good. So it took me a little bit of time, but a couple of things were really obvious. I instantly stopped sugar. This is like 1972. Okay, so I haven't had any since then. So very soon after that, stopped gluten, and it was wheat, rye, oats, barley. Oats don't really have gluten, but they're more often than not made in factories that also work with wheat, so they have gluten because of that. No milk, so no dairy. All of that fell to the wayside, and I've never ever gone back. And this is when, again, I was a child at the time. And as I grew older, when other silly things started to come about because I was older, there was never any hesitation on my part. I never had a sip of alcohol. I never done any of that, because to me, that was the antithesis of being a disciplined person and following the path that I had set for myself. So I never even, there was no pressure in me at all. I've always said that for me, the way that I became disciplined partly is due to the fact that I moved so much as a kid, because since I didn't really have a continuous group of friends that I grew up with, I had no peer pressure whatsoever. I just had me and my brothers, and martial arts sort of separated me from my brothers, because my brothers just didn't find any passion for it and dabbled a little bit, but not for very long. But I just fell very much in love with this. And so all of a sudden I was following what I eventually came to learn was actually called the solitary path, which is a martial artist path. And to me, I found great strength in that idea that it was my choices that were what made the difference. And an interesting note that just pops into my mind: when I was probably 8 or 9 years old, a much older kid than me, for whatever reason, just decided to shock me, because nobody in my house ever swore. So this kid comes up and just lays into me this litany of swear words. And I was just startled by this. And I get home, and my dad, who was not normally home early, just happened to be home. And he sees that I'm affected by something. So he asked me what was going on. And I told him what had happened. And he said, well, tell me what he said. You can't get in trouble. Just tell me what he said. So I laid out this horrifying litany of phrases. And he said something that just blew my mind. He said, so if he had been speaking Swahili, would it have had the same impact on you? And I said, no, I wouldn't have understood what he was saying. And he said, so who gives those words power? Mm. And again, that took it right back to what I was talking about, that it was all a solitary path. It was the choices I made. And this goes back to that, what can pull you into a violent altercation? It's the same thing. Who gives the words power to somebody who's calling you out? It's only you who gives those words power. So the whole idea of the training is to find that centeredness so that you're not so easily pulled into those childish kind of juvenile things. So that's what a disciplined life is for me. So people oftentimes, especially around Christmas time and so forth, they'll say, don't you miss this? Don't you miss that? Don't you want to have something? No is always the answer. I truly don't. You probably know that especially as an infant, but as a child, you have many more sensitive taste buds than you do as an adult. So I grew up all over the world. So I lived in Germany in the late 60s. And one of the places we lived there was above a German bakery. So every day I had the most fantastic bread you could ever have in your whole life. I mean, a drink with jam and bread, it's in the song, for Christ's sake, okay? Very good bread. So when I came back to the States, bread was like cardboard, it's horrible. So it was easy for me to stop those things. But more importantly, as an adult, I know that even if I went back to Germany to that same bakery, the bread would not taste as good to me now as it did then. So my memory of the taste is actually much more of a fond thing to hold on to than how it would taste now. So all I miss, and sometimes what I'll do is if I travel and I go to a place like that, I'll just smell it. Because as you know, your scent is a tremendous trigger for memory. So my scent of that will bring the memory back, and that's all I need. So if somebody's having chocolate, I go, let me smell it. Oh, that's great. I can taste it. But I don't even call it breaking, because to me, it's, again, that implies that there's a wall.
Yes.
And there isn't a wall. It's just a choice that I make. And I got to tell you, I just turned 60 a few days ago. Okay. So people have asked me for many years, for decades, what I do to stay healthy, to stay youthful. And I always say the same thing. It's not what I do now, it's what I've done all my life. Okay. And the first thing I would do, if I could give anybody a gift, as much as I have done martial arts all my life and love martial arts, if I could give any person a gift, I would give them the gift of discipline at a young age, so that they could make those choices, so that they wouldn't say things like, I can't live without peanut butter. This is building walls against yourself. Clearly, it's not true. Okay. But what an impregnable wall that they build and make impossible for them to overcome. Yeah. So, and they do that in some way. I could never live without my coffee. Of course you could. If I dropped you on a deserted island with everything you needed except coffee, you would survive. Okay. So the self-destructive foolishness of that is terrible in my eyes. And I wish if there's anything I could give them, it would be the discipline. So.
Thank you, Mark. If my friends wanted to find you, how can they find you?
I'm out of here.
It's not a P.O. box, right?
Remember, I'm armed. I'm super easy to find. I have the easiest website in the world, Fightology, the study of fighting, fightology.com. My phone number is on there. That's my personal phone number. I have it with me all the time. You can email me. I'm easy to find. Certainly not hiding. And everybody's always welcome to come study.
Mark, this has been remarkable, your share today. I'm very grateful. And all I have to say is there anything in your heart last to complete with us today?
You and I need to get together and train. It's been too long.
It's been way too long.
No, I will. I mentioned something to you. Pardon me for interrupting you. I mentioned something to you just before we start today. And it's important enough, I think, that maybe I wouldn't mind taking a moment. My extremely dear friend, Devin Borman, has an amazing school in downtown Vancouver. In fact, when people ask me in Vancouver, because I've been traveling there for years to teach, what school do I recommend that they study? And there's only one school that I ever recommend, and that's Devin's Academy Duello, which is on, I believe it's on Hastings.
Yes.
Devin's an extraordinary teacher. He teaches European swordsmanship, longsword, rapier, etc. But more importantly, he's truly a scholar and a warrior sage. He really is an astounding teacher. And I don't say that about many people, as you all know. I'm very particular about who I recommend. And I know lots of people who teach in Vancouver, and the only school I recommend is Devin Borman School, okay? So in the midst of this coronavirus thing, his school is on its knees. If you just look him up, look up Academy Duello, He has a GoFundMe going right now to try to save his school during this time, and I encourage anybody, $1, $5, $10, whatever they could give, it would be fantastic. I hope that they'll do anything they can. I'm certainly trying to get the word out for him. So he's an amazing teacher, and it's an amazing school. It's the largest European martial arts school in the world. Wow. So it's worth keeping, and it's something really special that Vancouver only has. So I hope it survives this.
I'll make sure to put links for his school and yours.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, friends, for joining. Thank you, Mark. I love you. I'm grateful for you. I'm looking forward to meet soon. Okay.
I'll talk to you soon, brother.
All right. Be well.